Okay, so what I want to do this evening, just looking at my watch, as you see, I have no notes, which is always both liberating and a little bit dangerous at the same time. Is that I come from a tradition of why use one word where several words will do. So I have been known to go on a bit. So I've got the watch just to temper myself. So what I want to do this evening is to give a Black theology interpretation of what I think is central to when we think about community and that sense of what it means to belong. And we're doing that at a time when we are seeing the pendulum, the political pendulum definitely lurch to the right. And the scariest things about our particular current moment is how unembarrassed we are. How unembarrassed we are. And what do I mean by that? Certainly, if you know anything about British history, you know one of the most significant moments was Enoch Powell giving his Rivers of Blood speech in 1968. And the two things that we have largely forgotten over the period of 50 odd years was firstly how popular his speech was at the time. At the time when he gave the speech, 300,000 trade unionists, 300,000 sent in letters of support and said that he speaks for us. So we have to remind ourselves of the dangers of a certain type of popularism. That many wiser people than me have said, just because it's popular doesn't make it right and doesn't make it true. But then secondly, is that once he made this speech, the next day Edward Heath, who was leader of the Conservative Party and they were in opposition, brought him in and sacked him on the spot and said that this speech has no place in our public discourse. This speech has no place in a democratic society where we are trying, however imperfectly, like to live together and find ways of engaging with each other. So he was sacked on the spot. And his career never recovered. He spent the rest of his life on the political backwaters as an Ulster Unionist. That's no disrespect to Ulster Unionists, but he was never a frontline politician again. And yet he was, by all accounts, a brilliant philosopher and linguist and classicist. So we're now in the era now where you can pretty much say the things he said, and actually not only will it not kill your career, actually it will make your career. It will allow you to be popular. It will allow you to have a platform and lots of people following you. And the most scary thing about it is the number of Christians who also have bought into that as well. So we have this rise of this thing we're now calling white Christian nationalism. And in one sense, it's not new, because it's always been there. We've always had the collusion of the Christian faith and its collusion with particular forms of entitlement and self-regard. That's not new. Our British Empire, the largest empire the world's ever seen, on which the sun never sets, so it includes Ash's home country of Australia. So if you go as far east as you can, Australia, New Zealand, Pacific Islands, and you go as far west as you can in terms of Canada, and various points between, including a small island called Jamaica, where my parents are from, all of that was under the aegis of the British Empire. That was a Christian empire. The British, the powerful people in Whitehall and in the Metropolitan, they believed that this empire was sanctioned by God. And of course, that there's a certain problematic way in which we think of providence, that we see the evidence is that if something's successful, then it must be of God. So their sense of, should I say, arrogance was, well, it must be of God, because if it wasn't, then look how, if it wasn't of God, then how are we being so successful? A country that's 44,000 square miles, there are states in the US that are bigger than the whole of the UK, and yet a quarter of the world was under its control, all those bits in pink on all globes and maps. So popularism and the nature of embedding the Christian faith into certain types of entitlement and entanglements with notions of power and significance for some and insignificance for others, or belonging for some and the marginalization and the critique of others is not new. It's only new in that there seems to be, at this moment in time, actually no shame in it, no embarrassment. So what I want to do is to go to the scriptures, which is what black theology has always done. So just give a very, very quick kind of précis on black theology. Now, to be fair, people do PhDs on this stuff, and I've read quite a few. Some are more interesting than others, I have to say. So there's a sense in which this very, very quick précis clearly does not do it justice. But it's the theology of liberation. And it's often said, and I would probably agree with this, that it's distinctive insofar as it's one of the few theological movements that was not started by academics. It was actually started by ordinary people. That historically, people who were enslaved and called slaves, I sometimes start my talk by introducing myself as Anthony George Reddie. Anthony, I'm named after Tony Benn, which I take as a mark of self-righteous vindication. I'm still a Christian socialist. I'm named after Tony Benn because my dad was a trade unionist and Ben was one of his heroes. George is my middle name. That is named after my great-grandfather, who was one of the first people in his part of Jamaica to learn to read, to get an office job, and he planted a church where my family still go. That's Belcastle Baptist Church, which is on a little village on the east coast of Jamaica in the parish of Portland. But Reddie, R-E-D-D-I-E, is a Scottish name. It's not an African name. And what that tells you is that at some point in the past, probably mid-18th century, a Scottish person, probably in exile from the Hanoverian government, leaves here as a colonial subject, but turns up in the New World as a privileged white body. And under the guise and the support of the Christian faith, largely, then becomes an owner of property that includes people, and names an enslaved person called Reddie after himself. So the roots of black theology don't start with intellectuals sat down writing books that people can barely follow. There's a joke I often make. So former US president was a guy called Harry S. Truman, and he was the one who followed Roosevelt. And one of his dictums, he said that when he was dealing with Congress, his golden rule was, if you can't convince them, confuse them instead. And I think many an academic book has been written on that basis. That, okay, so like you put lots of long words, string them together, put long sentences, throw in gratuitous terms that no one else will understand, and you pass it off as profundity and genius. If you can't convince them, confuse them instead. So long before people began to write those types of books, ordinary people of African descent who were designated as slaves, themselves never saw themselves as slaves. So it's interesting, you read older books and you talk about slaves. More modern books talk about enslaved peoples. Because the people never thought of themselves and never accepted the designation of slaves. And when they began to resist, as they always did, one of the key things that became part of their armory was never intended to be. This is the gift of the Holy Spirit and that sense of unintended consequences. When the various colonial regimes made enslaved peoples Christians, it was never on the basis that this would liberate them. It was on the basis that it would make them better enslaved persons. And so they would quote out of context Paul, particularly Colossians 3:22, Ephesians 6, slaves obey your masters. They would cite the example in the book of Philemon, where Paul sends Onesimus back to Philemon, doesn't set him free, and say, well, clearly slavery is part of God's economy, it's part of God's plan. This is what is the right expectation of how we see the political economy based on racial capitalism. Capitalism has always been embedded in the exploitation of bodies, always been. And so therefore, the movement of millions of people for profit. And if you want to get a sense of how massive that is, and just think of this basic fact. The country with the most people of African descent in it is Nigeria. Somewhere in the region of 200 million people. The country with the next most African people in it is Brazil. Brazil. So a country several thousand miles away has more African people in it than virtually every African country except Nigeria. That tells you how many people were shipped across the Atlantic for massive profit. That the whole of our Western capitalist system is based on slavery in terms of that provides the capital that then enables all the ingenuity to happen in terms of the 18th and 19th century, in terms of the Industrial Revolution. Yes, there's some very, very clever people who thought up some very, very clever gadgets and engineering, but if you don't have the capital to turn it into something, then those are just good ideas. Capital comes from slavery. So as a means of trying to get enslaved people to be more behaving, to be less rebellious, to spend less time trying to subvert the system, and even now we know that the strongest and most powerful form of justification is the infamous words or famous words of God said it was right. That's the most powerful set of vindications. If you think of radicalization in its various forms, what most people tell you is that God told me to do it. And of course, it's so powerful because it's really hard to refute, because the truth is, how many of us are in this room here because God told us to do something? So of course, it's not easy to rebuke or to resist, because you say, well, of course, God's nonsense, God doesn't talk to people. Then how many of us then actually would be in this room? How many of you would not be in ministry? Or if God had not said to you, this is something I want you to do. And so, of course, that sense of rationalization of revelation, of God speaking to people and justifying their actions, is one of the things that I think that all theologians have been wrestling with in terms of particularly those of us who care about justice. Because oftentimes the people we're trying to resist are not, let's say, godless atheists, they're people who say they believe the same God we do. So theology is important. Obviously, I would say that because I earn my living doing that, obviously. So I'm very self-interested in saying theology is important, but it is important. Because sacred texts, as we will see in a moment, have a powerful way of shaping how we behave. They have a powerful way of shaping our ethics. They have a powerful way of justifying what ultimately are questions of morality, what is right and wrong. So back in the 17th, 18th century, certainly back end of the 18th century, when people of African descent in the Americas and the Caribbean and also in Latin America, when they began to be cajoled into the Christian faith, what they discovered was not what the slave owners expected them, which was that what they found in the scriptures was a God of liberation. A God revealed in Jesus, whose life experiences was closer to their suffering than it was to the people who were proclaiming Jesus as Lord and oppressing them. Perhaps one of the greatest of all black theology books is by James Cone. And in 2013, he wrote a book, actually probably his last great book, called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Cross and the Lynching Tree. And what Cone does, he compares the cross and lynching and says that they are very analogous in the sense in which what they represent are two poles of human experience. The cross, on the one hand, in the hands of the powerful, represents the machinery of control and oppression and state-sanctioned violence. The cross was never about killing people. Romans were not so inefficient as to dream up a way of killing you that would take you 3 days. That's not particularly efficient. If you want to kill someone, a sword to the heart would be as efficient as a bullet to the brain in the 20th century. The cross was never about killing people, it's about humiliating people. That if you want to instigate a state of terror and to ensure that people will not resist, and you want to ensure that they understand the consequences of resistance to your sense of hegemony, your sense of untrammeled power, then what you do is that, like, you think up a way of making people die in the most horrendous, pitiable way possible. So if you crucified someone, they would probably take them about 3 or 4 days to die, and they'll probably die in the end because their lungs would collapse in on themselves. Because if you're hanging on a cross and you're dead weight, after a while you can't raise your body up to get enough air into your diaphragm, and you die effectively choking to death. And once you die and choke to death, then all your other organs give in, which probably means that all kinds of stuff that is released. And the whole point of that is it's scary, it scares everybody. It controls the fear of those people. So when you see someone die after 3 or 4 days on the cross, that is meant to say, lest anyone else get the stupid idea of trying to resist Rome, this is what happens to you. Cohn says, well, that's what lynching was. Lynching was never just about killing black people, it was about instigating a sense of terror against a group of people to say that our white supremacist way of operating is the only way, unless you get a clever idea of trying to resist, this is what will happen. So if you lynch someone, there are stories of people being lynched and then be pulled out of the fire, being unable to survive so they could throw them back into it again. Because you don't want the entertainment to end too quickly. And when the body was then being dismembered, people would auction off various bits of the body. And if it was a black male, the most prized thing that people would auction for would be the black male phallus. That's not about killing people, that's about terrorizing them. And Cohn says that therefore the cross is the ultimate form of reversal, because what was meant to be sanctioned as the ultimate in death and destruction, God made for a purpose of resurrection and redemption. So Cohn's not the only black theologian, but he's probably the greatest there has ever been. And his work and many other people's work was really a way of trying to narrate this ongoing black liberation struggle that had been in evidence for 3 or 4 centuries. Africans, people of African descent, had always been resisting, and certainly from the back end of probably the 18th and into the 19th century, their primary way of resisting was through the scriptures and through their Christian faith. Another example is in Jamaica. So the largest rebellion against slavery was instigated by Sam Sharp, a Baptist deacon. And Sam Sharp uses his understanding of the Christian faith, particularly the writings of Paul, and says that if I am free in Christ, then I'm free. And if I'm free, then I should not be subject to anyone, and that therefore then inspires his peaceful resistance initially. It only turns violent because, of course, what happens is that the forces of oppression will always meet peaceful resistance with violence, which then instigate more violence. So I say all that to say that one of the things that often happens when people hear the word black theology and other liberation theologies is that what we know always happens with the status quo, the people who have no vested interest in people fighting for liberation and freedom, is that they will demonize it. Now, in terms of Latin American liberation theology, one of my heroes was a bishop in Brazil, a guy called Don Helder Camara, who some of you may have heard of. And he had these 2 great sayings. He first said that when I help the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they're poor, they call me a communist. His other great quote was that when you want the poor to work harder, you take things off them. Think of austerity. But when you want the rich to work harder, you have to give them incentives and inducements to make them work harder. He says, we live in a system that has always been on the side of the rich and the powerful and has always oppressed the marginalized and the poor. But then, of course, what then exacerbates it is how propaganda then gets used to justify the status quo. So it's interesting how, through the Protestant work ethic, and again, we have to think about how Christianity and capitalism have often been embedded, certainly within the West. So much so that we have the language of the deserving and undeserving poor. And the truth is, all our governments, whether left or right, have always tried to find a surgical way of helping the people who we think should be helped. But somehow, let's punish the ones who are not really trying, the shiftless, the ones, the skivers, the ones who are work shy, supposedly, or on Benefit Street. It's funny how we never had the language of the undeserving rich, by the way. Again, that tells us about the inherent bias in our systems. So all that to say that when, following the murder of George Floyd, 5 years ago last month, and we had this sudden upsurge, maybe for the first time in a generation, maybe the first time ever, of ordinary people now thinking that maybe this systemic racism that some people have been talking about, well, maybe it's a real thing, maybe we need to do something. And so we saw a lot of performative action in Oxford University, where I worked. The previous vice chancellor, overnight just woke up one day, obviously had some revelation. Maybe God told her to do it. And she woke up and set up a race equality task force. Just said, actually, what we need is a race equality task force. We need a group of people to come together to look at Oxford and to see if we're racist, really, if, okay? To see if we're racist. And we'll ask Professor Anthony Reddie, because he's a black liberation theologian, so I'm told that I was the first person on this task force. So there was a period when everybody was into, let's look at this systemic racism. But of course, what we know also is there was also a pushback from significant groups of people who were stuck in a culture war. So I remember suddenly trending on Twitter. I was on Twitter. I kind of came off Twitter. It's not good for my mental health. But I was on Twitter and X one time. And at one point, I was trending all over the place because it's that the Church of England had a report from Lament to Action, which was their response to the nature of systemic racism in the Church of England. And this report had come out, and the church was looking to respond to it. And one of the things it said in the report was that we recommend that people trained for ministry should do some or have some exposure to black theology. And then a number of right-wing adjutants were saying, well, that it tells you that the Church of England is going to hell in a handcart, because now they're insisting that everyone has to do this black theology, that it's just full of critical race theory and Marxism. And one of the person who was quoted as one of the devils incarnate who was going to take the church to hell in a handcart was me. So Professor Anthony Reddie there said, with his dangerous teachings, he's going to distort and take the church into places where the devil wants the church to be. And I thought, wow, and I never knew I was so powerful. But here's the thing. So in the second half, I'm going to go to the scriptures. Because what I found interesting was that I had read Marx. That was about 40 years ago as an undergraduate student. I mean, it was some interesting ideas. I'm not a Marxist. I still prefer it though to capitalism, I have to say. But black theology has never been informed by Marxism. And I have read the odd text in critical race theory, but guess what? Black theology is not informed by critical race theory either. It is a combination of lived experience. There's a Jamaican saying that goes, who feels it knows it? Who feels it knows it? So what have you felt? What is your experience? All of us know experience is the greatest teacher. Okay, it's like you can go to university, you can read books, you can even read some of my books, and you'll learn a lot, but actually nothing will teach you as much as just simply living in the world and reflecting on your experience. I'm 60 years old, I'll be 61 in October. I first came here to Birmingham 42 years ago. And the biggest thing I find is that I now find myself driving around places of Birmingham and thinking back to what it was like when I first left Bradford to come here. And of course I've learned a lot, and of course that experience has shaped me. Yes, reading books has shaped me, but the truth is, experience is always the greatest teacher. So what black theology does, along with other theologies of liberation, is to say, what happens when we read the scriptures in light of our lived experience, in light of the reality that we know impinges upon us, and how then does that open up the scriptures to see God's liberating word, not just as a historical word, in terms of what happened in former times, but how does the Spirit still speak to us now, and still reveals God's self to us in the terms of what we should do in terms of Christian activism to make the world a better place. And so what I want to do is to read a biblical text that many of you will know very well. Some of you may have even preached on it. And then, obviously aware of the time, I will then reread that in light of Black theology as a way of helping us to think about community and place in our contemporary time. This is Luke 8, verses 40 to 48. This is a story of the woman with the issue of blood who touches Jesus. Sorry, woman who touched the hem of his garment. And I'll read as follows. So it was when Jesus returned that the multitude welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And behold, there came a man named Jairus, and he was the ruler of the synagogue. He fell down at Jesus' feet and begged him to come to his house, for he had only one daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. But as he went, the multitude thronged him. Now a woman having a flow of blood for 12 years, who had spent all her livelihood on physicians and could not be healed by any, came from behind and touched the border of his garment. And immediately her flow of blood stopped. And Jesus said, "Who touched me?" When all denied it, Peter and those with him said, "But Master, the multitudes throng and press you, and you say, 'Who touched you?'" But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I perceive power going out of me." Now when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him. She declared to him in the presence of all the people the reason she had touched him and how she had been healed immediately. And he said to her, "Daughter, be of good cheer. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Amen. So in many respects, we read that story, and many of us have read it, and as I said, many of us have preached on it, done Bible studies on it. And there's a sense in which we, with a lot of the scriptures, we know it so well that we've kind of domesticated it in our minds and think it's not particularly radical. But actually, if you know anything of the times, and if you think of our present reality, and what all liberation theologists try to do is to close the space between then and now, to say, if God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, but if human nature essentially hasn't changed either, then these scriptures are not just historical documents, or they're not just artifacts from the past, they also narrate something of our present way of being. And therefore, when you have these contemporary movements such as what would Jesus do, which I mean sometimes can be a little bit kind of facile, but there's a sense in which what they're trying to capture is that the most, certainly as Christians we would say, the most distinctive image we have of what God wants us to do is what we see in Jesus. So in the story, Jesus is with his disciples, and a very important person, Jairus, comes to him, the head of a synagogue. And we don't know much else about Jairus. I did a preachy version of this a number of months ago at King's College, London, and one of the chaplains came to me and was a little concerned. She says, "But I think you're being too hard on Jairus, because you seem to be making all these assertions about him, which we don't know." Now, in fairness, I thought that she, as is often the case with many situations, people read into what you've said and infer things that you never said. So I never attacked Jairus. There's no evidence that Jairus is not a good person. What we do know is that he's the leader of a synagogue, so he has influence. And what we know in many of our societies is that influence, and maybe even power, is not a neutral category. People with influence and power don't queue up and wait their turn. They never have. People with influence and power expect a certain level of entitlement. They expect a certain kind of, like those words which I pray I will never say, and if you ever hear me say it, you have my permission to get a stick and beat the crap out of me. If you ever hear me say something like, do you know who I am? I mean, trust me, if you ever hear me say that, please, actually just beat me, okay? But what we know is that if you have influence, there's a certain level of entitlement. You don't expect to do what everyone else has to do, because what's the point, therefore, of being influential? So without inferring anything negative on Jairus. I think it's not unreasonable to presume that when he goes to Jesus and says, my daughter is dying, he kind of expects Jesus like to get the hurry on. It's not unreasonable because actually, like I said, that's what we know in many of our societies is that if you have influence and you have access, then you have certain expectations. It's very interesting that years ago when I was at Queen's, one of the most interesting people I had the opportunity to spend time with was a guy called Darrell Bailey. So Darrell Bailey is a South African Methodist, missiologist, scholar, and he was on a scholarship from South Africa and was staying at Queen's. And he was interested in looking at the levels of corruption in South Africa, actually from a Christian perspective. And one of the things he said to me, which I'd long forgotten, is that oftentimes like we talk about corruption, but actually in the original derivation, it's always a two-handed thing. It's bribery and corruption. Well, people are corrupt, yes, but there's usually someone on the other end who's bribing them to be corrupt. And what we end up doing is having the corruption, but not thinking about the bribery. The reason why I say that is that if it wouldn't have been really cynical, in many so-called countries in the global south, we talk about, oh, this terrible, this corruption, all these rich people, all these influential people who are getting their own way because like they're giving backhanders. But of course in our democracies, of course actually, we have no such thing as corruption. What we have is lobbying. Of course that's not corruption. But if you have enough money and you can get access, you can encourage a politician to set legislation that is somehow sympathetic to you, but not to the poor or those who don't have access. So to be clear, I'm not accusing Jairus of anything, other than if human nature is the same now as it was then, he did not expect Jesus to dawdle on his way to him. He expects from that to get the hurry on because he's an influential person. He's the head of the synagogue. I'm not making that bit up. It says it in the text. He's the head of a synagogue. And so Jesus is on his way, and I suspect if the disciples are anything like just human nature, they're probably aware that this is a good, Jesus, if you get the hurry on and if you get to his house and you do what we know you can do, this will be really good for our movement. Because imagine having a head of a synagogue who's grateful to us because you've healed his daughter. So, okay, let's get the move on. And all of a sudden Jesus stops and asks one of those damn fool questions. Because he's in a throng and someone touched him. Now, obviously our scriptures are very brief and they're very compressed. And obviously what we don't know is what's not said between the lines. Because I suspect that as much as they would probably know of Jesus, that the disciples know a stupid assertion when they hear one. So everyone's pushing them, throwing it against them, and saying, someone touched me. It's like, but everyone's touching you, Jesus. I mean, come on now, If you know anything about the context of the time, that woman should not be there. By being there with the issue of blood, she's making everybody ritually unclean. She shouldn't be there. We don't know her name. And there's a crowd, and the crowd are there, and of course the crowd will be the enemy of the woman because she knows that if they find out that she's there, all hell will break loose. And what we know about crowds, I once had a brilliant doctoral student, a guy called David Joy. He is an Indian New Testament scholar, and he came to Queen's and did his PhD at Birmingham. And his thesis was on the role of the crowd in Mark's gospel. But he actually goes for all the gospels. He talks about this crowd and this crowd that follows Jesus everywhere. And the crowd, of course, is varied. It's made up of all kinds of people. People have different reasons for being there. Some people are there because they want to see a show, or they heard that Jesus actually does this fancy trick in magic stuff. So maybe if we're lucky, we might get to see it and maybe get to tell other people. Other people are just curious, what in Jamaican language we call just farce. Somebody actually just like to be there, just to be nosy. Other people are there because they have this sense that there's something different about him that might change my life. So there's all kinds of needs of certainly urban proletariat, people who are at the bottom of the rung of a colonized context. That's something that we've often edited out in our work around the scriptures. Because we are the biggest empire the world's ever seen, we're not that keen on identifying empire and the wickedness of empire, because obviously we ourselves were an imperial power. On a different talk, I sometimes look, in another talk, where I look at the scriptures, I juxtapose Jesus' encounter with Pontius Pilate. And the fascinating thing about that is how we look at this as Brits. And I say this as someone who is a British subject. This is a Yorkshire accent. And we look at the text and we imagine ourselves to be Jesus. And of course, like we aren't Jesus, we are Pontius Pilate. This country was Pontius Pilate. This country had all the versions of Pontius Pilate in the various parts of empire, including Australia, as governor generals to keep the natives in place. So it says something about how Christianity gets embedded with empire, that after all these years, actually we can look at it and not see ourselves and imagine ourselves to be Jesus. Well, Jesus was a colonized Jew. He was a colonized Jew in the midst of the Roman Empire. He had more to do with the people who were being subjugated than the people who did the subjugating. So Jesus is in the midst of this context, and he stops on his way to an important person in order to ask, if we're all, it's a damn fool question about who touched him. And the woman is incredibly vulnerable. And when she makes herself, reveals herself, she knows that in a worst case scenario, she's taking her life in her hands, because she could be easily stoned for the crime of literally making everybody in this crowd unclean. And the crowd would have turned on her, because what we know about crowds, again, in every generation, both then and now, is that there's a certain dynamic that happens when people get together. And psychologists have shown this, that there are ways in which people will consent to something in a crowd, which if you sat them down by themselves and asked them rationally, would you do that? They would say never. But in a crowd, there's a dynamic that happens that then takes you away from your normal good sense. And crowds have ways of advocating for things that they would never do normally by themselves. As I said, this is not new. Psychologists have shown this. And let's not forget that when the crowd has a choice between Jesus and Barabbas, they choose Barabbas. And Pontius Pilate gives in to the crowd. So, of course, the truth is, he's not the first politician to give in to popularism. He's not the first politician who thinks, well, actually, there are some people here who have been victimized and marginalized and abused, and there are some people who are doing the abusing, but in estimate, it's kind of convenient to go with this group because that makes better politics. He's not the first nor the last politician, actually, who will side with the crowd and side with popularism. So the crowd are there, and this woman reveals herself. We don't even know her name. And the thing I've always found fascinating, ever since I first heard this as a kid, and I've preached on it many times, is that Jesus doesn't have to reveal her because she's already healed. The moment she touched his garment, she was healed. So presumably, she can now be rehabilitated. She can now go into public spaces. She can now go amongst other people because she has been restored. But Jesus asked repeatedly, who touched me? And so she reveals herself. And I think, me inferring this doesn't say in the text, that I think what Jesus is doing is that he wants her to be acknowledged. He wants her to be seen. He wants her to be seen by others and for her to have that moment of agency and recognition. And actually, if we know anything about human nature still, is that people want recognition. People want to be heard. So one of the things we know about the Brexit thing, and it still rankles me. I wrote a whole book about it. But unfortunately, it sold for £145, so no one ever bought it. That's my capitalism for you there. But one of the things I was very clear about was I was not demonizing the people, I was demonizing the politicians who manipulated them. Because the place I grew up in, Bradford, West Yorkshire, East Bowling, BD4, it's one of the poorest wards in one of the poorest cities, is that nearly everyone voted to leave. They're not stupid, they're not ridiculous people, they simply wanted to be heard. And left and right, both major parties are largely taken them for granted and ignored them. And of course, we know that nature abhors a vacuum. So if no one else is telling you you matter, then along comes reform. And they will tell you what you want to hear, a form of popularism. So we have to find ways of attacking the root cause of that without demonizing the people. Because telling people they're stupid actually, surprising enough, never works. So Jesus recognizes the woman, says, you're healed, but it's not enough that you're healed. I want people to know and see that you are here, you belong. She's an unknown person. We don't know her name, in a patriarchal society, she shouldn't even be there. So here's the killer thing for me, if we want to take this as a model of community building and what it means to belong. How different would our world be if we had politicians who said, you know something, Jairus, you're important, but you can wait because I'm going to deal with this woman who has no, put it this way, like, there's no social advantage to be had by helping her. But yet I will put her first. And it's not that it doesn't help Jairus, it's just that Jairus can wait. How different would our democracies be if we had politicians who genuinely had a preferential option for the poor and the marginalised rather than the rich and the powerful? How different would our nature of belonging be? How different would it be if someone who shouldn't even, or the perception is that shouldn't even be there, and is somehow seen as a problem, is held up as being the person we should care about precisely because of their marginalisation? How different would it be if we had an honest conversation about immigration? Actually, rather than the lies that often get told. And I say lies because actually when we were in the midst of the pandemic, what we saw was actually, so who runs all the jobs that we don't want to do? Oh, guess what? It's immigrants. I was in a very fancy conference in Oxford. I mean, Oxford does fancy, it has to be said, you know. It's very good at doing fancy. And I have to confess, as a champagne socialist, I like a bit of fancy. You know what I'm saying? You know, I mean, okay, I'm not the first Labour well, I say Labour, actually, I've left the Labour Party. But I've confessed, like the Methodist Church, which you didn't mention, I kind of, it's a bit like a yo-yo. I join it, I leave it, I join it, I leave it. I mean, I've left at the moment. I might go back, but I've left at the moment after Starmer's last bit of actually kowtowing to popularism. So I'm sorry, but I can't be a part of a party where a Labour leader is going to tell these vicious lies. So I left. Like I said, I might go back, who knows. But there is something about our dishonesty about the nature of our society. There's always been jobs that only immigrants will do because only immigrants will do it, if we're honest. So I'm in this fancy hotel and I don't see one white face serving me in the whole weekend I was there. So people who clean my rooms were from the Middle East. People who served me were from the so-called Far East. When I was growing up, actually people at the bottom of the ladder were Irish, actually. But the next generation on, because what happens is that people come at that entry level and then they work hard. Because again, here's the thing, no one works harder than migrants. No one leaves places where home is home, and for whatever reason you leave it in desperation and then come and think, oh, I'll tell you what, I'll sign on for that, the little bit of money they're going to give me. No, what you do is take 2 and 3 jobs in order to send money back home to people who are dependent on you. So when I was growing up in Bradford, it was Irish. In the next generation, it was Eastern Europeans. There's always a different level, because people come, they work hard, they move up to the next level. This notion that somehow, if we get rid of all the immigrants, lots of British people actually will suddenly now get up that, and now suddenly want to do the jobs that they've never wanted to do, is a fallacy. Everyone knows it's a lie, but we still perpetuate the lie because it's convenient to do so. So the truth is that there's not one political party that's going to stand up for immigrants because there's no votes in. And there's too much popularism and too much media scare and too much vitriol in the media to make us be honest about the fact that if you're a capitalist country, which we are, then you will always need cheap labor because that's how capitalism works. So it's fine, okay, if we don't want immigrants and we don't want those people coming to our country, then let's abandon capitalism, right? And then let's have a society that's more like Sweden or Finland or Northern Europe, when most like democratically socialist. What we see in this text is something fundamental about the kingdom of God that is not the kingdom of mammon. Jesus puts this woman first. He's not bothered about what the crowd's going to say, whether they're going to like it or not, because truth is truth, and popularism is popularism, and they're not the same things. So she comes first, and Jairus waits. He still works for Jairus. He still cares, because we know God cares about everyone. So it's not that God doesn't care about rich and powerful people. A preferential option for the poor doesn't work on the basis that the poor somehow are more moral or more ethical than rich people. It's simply not the case. Actually, human beings are human beings, and all of us are sinful. God has a preferential option for the marginalized and the poor because God is just. It's about God. It's about God. It's not about human beings. The mistake Marxism made was to attribute some kind of moral imprimatur, some kind of moral identity to the notion of being poor and marginalized. That is a fundamental mistake, because all of us are, if we're honest, are sinful and biased. There's no evidence that if you took the poor and gave them resources that the rich had, that suddenly like, they become ethical and behave better than the people who exploited them before. Never happens. It's a myth. Marxism's fundamental mistake is to misunderstand human nature. Capitalism's success is to understand human nature too well, which is it's about selfishness. That if you can find a way to hoard resources and exploit someone else and make a profit doing so, then that works, and that's why capitalism is still with us. But just because it's successful, or at least it pretends it is, doesn't make it right. So my black theology interpretation of this text is that this woman, I see as a woman of colour. The text doesn't tell us that at all. I'm just thinking about what does it mean to be marginalised, to be despised, to be not seen, and to be seen as a problem. Jesus takes her side. He makes space for her. He could have easily have walked on. She was already healed. So in terms of our thinking about community, what would it be if we genuinely put the marginalised and those who are stigmatised at the heart of it and give them priority? And say to the likes of Jairus, and to be clear, I'm not imputing anything negative to Jairus. But the fact is, as someone who's leader of the synagogue, and we know his name, and he has influence, he can afford to wait. Jesus still gets to him and still actually does the miracle on his daughter. But the truth is, in our normal political economy, he would have sped to her first and not even given the woman a second thought. My final words are this, and these are hard words to hear, and I say it as much to critique myself, that I think one of the biggest indictments have always been as Christianity in this country and many other places is how little our faith makes a difference in terms of how we think about others and the media and in terms of our politics. If we really took the scriptures and Jesus' message seriously, we should not be voting for parties that want to bring in austerity. We should not be voting for parties that want to drop the bridges and kick people out because they don't belong, even though they're doing the jobs that we know ourselves that we would not want to do. If our faith really did orientate our lives rather than it just being fixed in on a very convenient way alongside our own vested interests, then surely our country will look differently because it is a democracy. A black liberationist reading is not the only reading one can make, but for me, it's a reading that enables us to see that God's ways are not the ways of human beings. And our invitation then and now is to follow Jesus and not just to worship him. Thank you.
Just making sure it's what you want, right? Yeah. Okay. Well, first off, that was amazing. That was a great talk. And I was asked to come up with a couple points or rebuttals, if you will, to this. But you so intrigued, it just tied everything together, it had me nodding almost the entire time. And it's true, especially your last point, and I want to point this out, kind of wrote it here. Our faith has little impact on us. And I know that's me kind of summarizing what you said, but if we truly dig into it, how true is it? Because many of us, and me growing from you and reflecting on my own work with Christian nationalism in the States, I'm researching two specific churches in a Midwestern state that was a swing state from 2016 to 2020 to 2024. So this state is one of the states that went from blue to red to blue to red. And for the most part, the people in these churches claim to be Christian. They have faith. They go to church every Sunday, or at least as much as they can. They read their Bibles. They pray. They teach their kids. They're involved in mission trips. But when it comes to their politics and their theology meet that politics, the one thing that sticks out from somebody who we consider in America a MAGA Republican is this: their politics comes first, because it's about separating myself from scriptures because, and they won't admit it, of their selfishness. It's a me first, then you. So in a sense, when we talk about the preferential option for the poor, in this story, Jesus turns to the person he doesn't need to turn to a woman who literally should not be there, who has not had pretty much contact with anybody for 12 years, because if you don't know this, right, if you're bleeding and you're a woman, you are in a separate space. If we're talking about creating spaces like you are, she was separated from her community for 12 years. And now in this tight space, you see the crowd pressing in on Jesus, being touched. And I thought this was important that you said was, he acknowledges the one who shouldn't be acknowledged for touching him. And what's interesting, and you didn't point this out, but I thought about it while you were talking, was he said, I know somebody touched me, I'm paraphrasing again, because power went from me. So who did the power go to? Did his power go to the ones touching him all over? To the ones demanding him to do something? Or from the one who snuck behind him, knowing she did not deserve to be there, nor deserve Jesus' blessing? That's who the power went to. But in a sense, when he turns around and acknowledges her, he's acknowledging to the group that this woman is important. This woman is a child of mine who I want to bless, because you already said she's already healed, but he wants the crowd to know, I healed her. But when it comes to Christian nationalism in America, what happens is I want the blessing. I want God to do this for me. Because I go to church, because I read my Bible, God needs to do this for me. And until I get it, I can't help anybody else get it. Or I refuse, honestly, to go out of my way to let somebody else get it. And hence, your assumption, right? Jairus is probably going, what in the world's he doing? Why? My kid's dying. Like, let's go. If you're in America, guaranteed, if this story happened in modern day times, somebody would be pulling Jesus by the arm, saying, forget that woman, she's not worth it. And in a sense, how can we claim this faith in Christ, who calls us to the marginalized, to the one we shouldn't acknowledge, but then vote for somebody who's completely opposite of what Jesus does. For in America, we all know this, and I know you Brits know this too. Trump is not a man who is willing to stop in a crowd to reach out to the one that's on the ground, hoping for a prayer for a miracle. He'll step over them, guaranteed. He's mentioned, I can shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and not be arrested. That's how much he cares about others. That's why we see riots in the streets of LA with ICE, immigration, and the police, and the Marines, and the National Guard coming in. Because I have faith in a God that I must protect and know that he's on my side. The minute we allow ourselves to cross that line and look at the immigrant eye to eye and say, I want to put you first, that's when we start engaging the gospel. But until then, when we're defensive and always protecting ourselves, as you mentioned, there's no way we can claim that same gospel. But somehow millions and millions of Christians do. So I just want to thank you, because your clarification just really ignited my vision and my imagination. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for such a in-depth and wise lecture. It's always been a blessing to hear you speak, and it brings me back to the classroom, to the lecture times at Queen's, being so amazed, being transformed, going, this is amazing. I want to share a little story. About 2 weeks ago, I was coming away from a meeting, and I was in a car with 3 other white people, and we stopped off at the shop, a little kind of village shop. We wanted some sandwiches. So we went into the store and we were looking at something to eat, and the lady who was serving us was very polite and very friendly. We bought our sandwiches. We were standing outside, and she came outside and she asked me a question. She said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Birmingham." And she stopped and said, No, where are you really from?" And I said, "I'm really from Birmingham." And she said, "But where are your parents from?" "Oh, I understand. You want to know where my parents are from, not where I'm from, because that's what you asked me." It turned out she's from Trinidad, and she just wanted to tell me that she was from Trinidad. So when I think of the woman with the issue of blood, when I think of your words that, she was invisible, she had no voice, she was despised, shouldn't have been there, I can identify with that as a black woman. And I would just want to ask the question, how does an ordinary individual who has very little power, voice, who isn't seen, and when we think about community and belonging, my father lived in Winson Green for kind of 30 years, so he literally lives around the corner. Well, his house is round there, on the corner, because my father passed away 5 years ago. Knowing what we know of this community, that it's a community that is not always seen, it's not always given voice, not always a space for powerful. How do we encourage a sense of belonging? And what does it actually mean when you are in a community that those words are undeserving poor? Those are lazy people, where there is high crime, where there is, high poverty levels, where, there is, addictions, and those communities that we consider to be problematic. How do we begin to affirm, like putting the woman first? How do we do that in a way that does affirm communities and enables them to have a sense of belonging? Because immediately when that woman asked me who I was, and I was in a group of 5 white people, I felt very, very much invisible, and wanted to hide. So how do you continue to, and how do we continue to affirm people, journey with people, put those who we feel are marginalised first, in a way that does affirm them, in a way that it isn't about being a do-gooder, but actually enabling people to be who they are. So yeah, I hope that's a question that you can respond to.
Goodness, yeah. Like the others, thank you so much. I always find myself wrestling with what I hear in Anthony's presence. It's no shock that that's true again. I kind of broke my response down into 2 sections, really. One was the section of what I took to be a prophetic rebuke, which was really good. As in speaking words out that serve as prophecy over us, if you like. One would be the reminder that bad theology kills people. And so for those of us in the room who are wrestling with theology all the time, it matters that we do it well. One is that a reminder, I suppose, that collusion is part of the habit of Christians and that no one is exempt from that. And so how are we colluding and where? Another is the reminder that people who have dignity, who rediscover their inherent dignity, can become resistors of empire. But that dignity is to be wrestled with. Is it bestowed, given, imparted, granted, innate, inherent, owned? That's a huge one, I think. A warning that we should be very cautious about the words, God made me do it, or God told me to, or God called me to, or God says. And therefore that it seems good to the Holy Spirit and to us becomes something we need to wrestle with. Who's the us? And how do we surround ourselves with other prophets? A warning that to speak out in any form of liberation might mean we're demonized, victimized, rejected, despised, all kinds of things, potentially to ultimate violence, though potentially to many other forms of violence that we experience in silencing, marginalizing, and so on. A challenge to help us to read ourselves as colonized, colonizing, colonizers, and to figure out where we sit in that. So we've got like 3 people from various colonies up here, like first generation, an American, an Australian, a Canadian. You, British people who have this story, I mean, it's really interesting, right? Where are the intersections, and how do we read ourselves as Pilate? How do we read ourselves as Pharisees? How do we read ourselves as tax collectors? How do we always read ourselves as the other? And who should be doing that reading? Is it everybody or some people? So then you pose these questions that I've distilled, and I don't know, I'm putting them back to you, I suppose, but you know, who are our prophets? Who should we be listening to right now? And are there the Tony Benns of the world? I was really struck by what you said there. Initially, I thought it was Tony, like from Tony Benn and then from King George. And I was like, man, that's a combination when you said your name. And I was like, you know, who is it that we are shaped by? Not just in the Christian sphere, if you see what I mean. Who's the prophet right now? And how do we rally to their side? Where are we conscripted into the status quo? Because I do think it's a conscription. sometimes. And when we are in a system, Professor, whether it's the Church of England, the shout-outs, the URC, the College of Nazarene, of Formation, of the almighty Oxbridge, what do we do with the systemic collusion that we're a part of? And how do we recognize that we have power within that and exercise it rightly? We can't absolve ourselves of the power even if we speak against it. So what do we do with that? What are we learning through our lived experience of the living God? I loved your talk, or the shaping of this around scripture. God speaks. How do we hear? And if we're not learning of God through our lived experience, then what are we doing with ourselves? So how do we repent and reconvert to become embedded listeners and learners? And when we do have this influence and we want to be in the upside down kingdom of God, or whatever other phrase we want to use there, how do we assure ourselves that we're being disrupted in the right way and interrupted in the right way, and participating in creating belonging, knowing, naming, daughtering? That's the best bit of that story for the daughters in the room, I think. You're healed and your daughter, her bigger name in a way. And so what do we do with this so that we can be participants in all of that? Anyway, thank you. It was really thought-provoking.
So Anthony, just a few questions to answer from those brilliant responses. Thank you, friends. And we've got about 15 minutes left, so we've got Anthony to respond to the responders. But if you've got a question that you want to ask as well, please come to the front, and we'll have some Q&A as well. So please don't be shy. We've got about 15 minutes left before we close. But any response to the responders?
Well, first, thank you for listening so intently. I give quite a lot of talks. I'm not always convinced that people are actually listening, so thank you for your sharp engagement. I think the other thing, well, I just want to say two very, very quick things, which I didn't say in the talk. One was that I think the older I get, the more I realise that the important thing about being embedded in community is about accountability. Because what good community does is it calls you out. I remember years ago there was an interview with Graham Greene, famous novelist, one of my favourite novelists. And he was asked the remarkable quality of his novels. They said, for the most part, you've rarely written a dud, they've all been really good. How have you written such good novels? And he said, paused for a second and said, because I have really good crap detectors. And the interviewer, obviously, Radio 4, obviously, was not expecting those terms. He said, okay. So what do you mean? I said, well, he said, I have a number of good friends and readers who, when I give them something, they don't read it as, obviously, Graham Greene. They read it dispassionately as, is this any good or is it crap? And if it's crap, they'll tell me. And I'm fortunate in that one of the things, just even yesterday I was asked, so do you live in Oxford? I said, no, I still live in Birmingham. Now, admittedly, I live in Moseley, so, okay, let's not get too much, if you're not about Birmingham, I live in a cappuccino, cappuccino, red wine drinking, Guardian reading heart of Birmingham, so, it's not here, okay, so let me not get too many aggressors about he's not being down with the people, okay, not really, when I live in Moseley, like I said, I'm a champagne socialist, okay, so, but part of staying in Birmingham is to stay grounded. It's to be alongside people who are not impressed with Oxford, and if you behave like a prat, they'll tell you. And I think that's important, because I think where people go wrong, I'm not aware of leaders who set out to become something that they never intended. I think what happens is it creeps. It's that thing about sort of sitting on a boat that's not anchored and the tide just simply slowly takes you away. And then before you know it, like you're nowhere near land. So I think this community, all communities, that people should be embedded in community. Because what it does is it holds up the marginalised, but it pulls down, or at least it pulls back, those who are at the front, who have too much entitlement and their voice is too heard, or they are given too much visibility. So that's the first thing. And then that then leads to the second one. So the question was about, well, how then do we deal with this kind of revelation? How do we get a sense of what is the authentic voice of God? Well, that's only community. You know, I'm always wary, even in scripture, where you have that lone individual who God speaks to, and somehow actually no one else hears that voice. Because invariably, actually, good things don't come from that. At best, I've always been, and I believe in more so now than when I was younger, if God has something important to tell us, then God will give it to more than just one person. So how then do we find communities where all our voices are heard, even the ones where we know it's some awkward bugger who just has a way of just saying things that just annoy you? Because every now and again, actually, a prophetic word comes through them.
It's true.
And scripture actually gives us lots of examples of the most unlikely person being the one who is not the sole voice, but the one who maybe kickstarts the process. And so for me, actually, and so talking about community and placemaking is about how then do we hear all the voices? How do we ensure that the ones who have the more power and influence and articulacy don't end up being overly powerful? Because that happens in all our contexts. So I'm a Methodist, and so because we've always been obsessed with the Church of England and their ways of doing things, that almost as a gut reaction, like we just do stuff in the opposite way. So our reason not to have bishops is simply because that the Church of England has them. Really, that's our only real reason, to be honest. So we do it in group processes, and we say, of course, that's more democratic. And in a sense it is, but really it isn't. Because I've had a pound for every time I sat in a room where we've debated it, and you know that certain voices in the room will sway the meeting. Certain people will have a certain perspective. And I've got to admit it, and I hate to acknowledge it, but, I'm now one of them, so I'll sit there and mind my own business and say, so Professor Reddie, what do you think? And I know at that point, actually what I say could well sway the whole meeting and change it dramatically from what's happened in the previous hour, even though in theory all of us have spoken. So we have to find ways of being accountable, but not falling into just the world and the influence of certain voices and certain personas that carry more authority than others.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor? Anyone like to? Yeah. Go ahead. Do you want to come forward? Yeah, just so I can hear you.
I hope I'm not about to be one of the annoying buggers, but I'd forgotten how much I disagreed with you from 20 years ago when you lectured me, and I just wanted to give the theory that the white Christian nationalism thing has grown up not because black theology has failed, but actually because it's succeeded, and that every kind of action has an equal and opposite reaction. And there's not really much of a reaction against environmentalism in theology because it hasn't really changed very much. And liberating theology outside the Catholic Church hasn't really provoked much of a reaction because nobody really cares. But white Christian nationalism, if it's an equal and opposite reaction, has provoked, it's a much bigger thing, perhaps because there was a danger you were about to win without a competition, and maybe they thought, well, we can't let that happen. So maybe thesis, we're seeing antithesis. Is there any hope that we might see synthesis at some point?
Okay, so in a perverse sense, I would love to believe that the success of black theology has given rise to white Christian nationalism, not because I think I think white Christian nationalism is a good thing. Obviously, I don't. It's just that from my perspective, I probably see the largely ineffectual nature of black theology, so I'm not convinced that it's really stirred anything, but I get your point. But it's interesting that in America, it was the election of Obama that then gave rise to Trump. And so I suspect that like you could be onto something. I don't think it's necessarily black theology, I think it's been the success of multiculturalism. Actually, I think that what we have found is that people find a way of engaging with each other, just at a very basic human level. So this notion of race, it's a construct. We know that there's only one race, that's the human race. And we know human beings are more alike than unalike. And so it's not unsurprising that the places where we're seeing the strongest pushback, for example, in terms of white fragility, isn't places like Birmingham. It's not here. It's in the places where, for the most part, the minority voice is a relatively small one. Because I think when we are juxtaposed with each other, that doesn't make us automatically like us, but we have a sense of familiarity. You know, I mean, so I think part of what has shaped my social outlook is that I've lived in two places of pluralism, so Bradford and Birmingham. And so for me, difference is just part of life, you know. I mean, I can still swear in Punjabi because I know that when I used to play football back in Bradford, it was my Asian friends who taught me how to swear at the white referee, and they would know what we were saying. Obviously, I'm not proud of that. That was not my best moment in terms of being a follower of Jesus. But I say that to say that we are more alike than unalike. And I think part of the fragility or the pushback is that white Britishness has never had its own story. That's one of the failures of state-sanctioned multiculturalism. So I remember in Bradford, like, we would go for our so-called cultural classes. I mean, you know, it was nonsense. And I've told a story in other places of being sort of sent with a small white woman who was about 4'7", and she brought out a steel pan to sort of teach us about our culture. Well, first, that's Trinidad, that's not Jamaica. Secondly, I was 11 years old, and everyone after was a slave. And to be honest with you, I mean, I want to be a noddy holder. You know, I mean, I wasn't interested in playing the steel pan. But what was significant was all the white kids would have sat out into the playground, and they said, "Well, you'll have no culture, so just play amongst yourselves." And what that state multiculturalism did, it caused division where it did not need to exist at that. Because at that point, all of us acted like we're just Bradfordians. But then suddenly it was like, oh, yeah, but some of you have this culture and some of that culture. It was well-meaning, but I think it helped to stoke this sense of white resentment. What I'm seeing, and one of the things that I think is really exciting, is the work of Al Barrett, and who some of you know, who does live in Birmingham. And it's the development of a thing called critical white theology. So essentially what they're doing in critical white theology is, we've always had white theology, like it's just never called itself that. But insofar as God is where two or three are gathered, so if two or three are gathered in white, then clearly God is there, obviously being alongside them. So being white itself is not the issue. The issue is, how do we reconfigure it so it doesn't have to be about privilege and entitlement, but it's still a contextual sense of what it is to be in a place if you come from a place. And so what is exciting, I mean, I've just credited a book, but I've just warned you, it sells for 150 quid. So no one here is going to buy it, I'm sad to say. But it's called Towards a Critical White Theology. And what the authors are doing, I mean, I'm one of the co-editors with Jill Marsh and Al Barrett, is in the book we've invited lots of white scholars to talk about their stories and talk about their experience. In the same way that I talked a little bit about my story in terms of being born in Bradford, these are my names. Everyone has a story. And white story itself isn't the problem, it's the kind of stories we tell. And what we need to retell is a version of British identity that is enormously generous and is enormously supportive. So for example, one of the heroes of my growing up were a white family on our street called the Venners, and they were anti-racist before it was fashionable. And when we faced racism on the street, our biggest supporters in terms of people who would turn up and defend us and say, how dare you speak to this family like that with this family. And they're important because at a time I could have said, but all white people are racist. Well, actually, no, they're not, because there were these people. And there are always these fantastic stories. There's a great story of, and those who are URC, can I put your hand up? Okay, so Frederick Douglass, African-American freedom fighter, anti-slavery abolitionist, comes to Britain in the 1850s and asks for support from ordinary working class people saying, we need you to boycott working with American cotton. Because so long as there's capitalism, as long as there's a market for it, then America has no desire to stop doing this. But if you stop taking it, then this will help. And so he goes around the different cities, but particularly in the north, and goes to many northern cities, and I think he goes, actually, he probably from a congregational church in Bolton, but I think it's now part of the URC. Yeah, and he goes there, and they mount a strike. And they strike and they say that we will not handle cotton. And their reason for doing so, they said, is because we're Christians and we believe in a commonwealth, Christian commonwealth. And we know that wherever people in the body of Christ are being persecuted, then these are our people. And so we recognize these people, even though that we'll never meet them. We recognize them as being as our kins. These are ordinary working class people. These are people who we are told would vote for Brexit now. So they identify with enslaved peoples. And they strike, and they do not handle cotton, and they get all kind of pilloried. They get attacked by the press, you can imagine, as being agitants and be communists and whatever. But their refusal to do it, says Frederick Douglass, obviously he can't prove it, but years later he comes back and preaches in that church and says, you will never know how much your support, even if it didn't bring it down, just the sense that we knew that people on the other side of the world were on our side. Now, when people say to me, well, the problem with the British is because, it's like, well, okay, well, no, that's one version of it. But there are lots of stories of people who have acted in a selfless way because their faith inspired them to be in solidarity. What we need to do is tell different stories. Because yes, there's a certain type of way of being British or English that is problematic. But then there are other stories about giving succor and giving support to people who are marginalized because we recognize that in their struggle it is our struggle. And so we need to tell better stories, and as Christians we've got the best story to tell. So we then should be in the business of giving people hope against fear, because really what's happening at the moment is that people are fearful and a particular party is stoking that fear, and we should say actually, like, we have nothing to fear. We are in a far better place than we ever were. Is there anyone who really wants to go back to the, I'm not the 1940s. Even the people who say they don't really want it. It's just rhetoric, because actually, as Martin Luther King said, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It's only bending in one direction, and it's bending in a direction that is a progressive move, not woke. Although actually, I have no problem with woke. If you understand that the derivation of it, it is to be awake against injustice. But we're only moving in one direction, so we can't let bigotry actually pull us back.
We'll stop there. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you, Anthony. Please give him another round of applause. Thank you for our panelists. I want big thanks to our chefs, our cooks tonight as well. And Sharon's out the back there. Sharon is